Welcome to the Web Platform Podcast, a developer discussion that dives deep into all things web. We discuss topics relevant to developing for the modern web and the web platform of today, tomorrow, and beyond.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Web Platform Podcast, episode number 171. Today we're talking about CSS In-Depth. We are your hosts this week, Justin Ribeiro, Leon Rebel, Danny Blue. Leon, Danny, hello.
Hey.
Hey, Justin.
How goes it, y'all?
Raining again.
I can't solve that problem. I can't prioritize that either. Sorry.
I just got a new MacBook, and I'm living in a world of dongles at the moment. Utopia.
Oh, dongles. Move to Linux. Be one of us, Danny. Be one of us. I'm sorry, we're sidetracked already. Before we introduce our guest this week to talk about CSS and all the wonderful things, we're going to throw it over to Leon, who's going to talk about This Week in the Web in 2 minutes or less. Leon.
Thanks, Justin. So first of all, alongside Google Chrome's 10th birthday, Chrome 69 has just been rolled out, and that includes a whole host of new updates. So there's a new material design UI update, and it has some new features such as the ability to generate strong passwords, and these get synced straight into your Google account, and also the ability to search your Google Drive directly from the URL bar. There's loads more features as well, so check out the link to find out all about them. There's a new version of VS Code, the popular editor if you use that, 1.27, and it includes CSS import path completion, a new terminal menu for creating terminals and managing tasks, and loads more stuff as well. So check out the link to find out all about that new update. Here's an exciting one, or at least for us web component nuts. Firefox 63 has just gone into beta, and it's got loads of new features, but it also has custom elements and shadow DOM enabled by default, so that's pretty exciting. Vue Sax, it's a new collection of UI components for use with Vue.js. There's loads of buttons and all of the usual stuff in there. Really, really nice looking components which you can just drop into your Vue.js applications. So go and check that out. And finally, is Houdini ready yet.com is a site published and maintained by Surma. And it's a site basically detailing support for the different specs which make up the Houdini feature set across all of the major browsers. So check that out to see if Houdini is going to be available and see how the progress is going on with that. And that's everything from me for This Week in Web. Thank you, Justin.
Thank you, Leon. Interesting things. We're happy about Firefox 63. I know you are. I am as well. And the Houdini stuff, if we've talked about it on the show before, but Houdini is pretty trick. I'm looking forward to that in a wonderful land of really custom CSS things. And speaking of CSS, we've got a great guest this week, Aimee Knight. Aimee, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me. It's been a while.
I know. I was trying to remember yesterday how long it's been. It's so good to have you back.
Thank you. It's probably been like 2 years, which I can't believe that. That's crazy, but it's
too long.
But I think that's the truth. So, yep.
So for folks out there who don't know who you are, tell everyone a little bit about yourself.
Sure. So I'm going to be talking about CSS today, but I'm not really doing so much CSS anymore. But right now I am in Nashville, Tennessee. It's also raining here right now. And I work for a company called Built Technologies, and I'm full stack there. So that's why I'm not really doing so much CSS anymore. But last year, I really took a huge deep dive into CSS because at the time I was working for a company that got acquired by Warner Brothers. And I realized how poor my CSS skills were. But backing up a little bit, so I'm full stack developer there. Became a Google developer expert this year in web technology. So that's why I like to still talk about CSS, but doing more and more in JavaScript again, which is my true love. What else? I used to be a former competitive figure skater, and I don't know. I feel like somehow I have become the voice for junior developers. So I'm like junior dev for life.
You've had such a storied history, Aimee, across a wide range of things. Like it's. And hey, you bring experience where experiences was had. So the notion that you were a competitive figure skater and the notion of CSS seem like two things in juxtaposition to me, given the nature of the precision that is figure skating, but also the precision that is CSS and the fact that CSS does not want to necessarily do these things half the time. Or at least so we think.
Yep.
You know, when we talk about CSS, like, what do we mean in depth? Because when you talk about the deep dive you did last year, like, you went really deep. You went into the hey, how do render trees and things like this work? Like, you're talking a level of CSS that most folks probably haven't been down.
Yeah. So it's when I got to this company that was acquired by Warner Brothers. And at this point, I'd been programming like 3 years or so. So when I first started programming, I felt like I could write CSS all day long. And the quote unquote programming part, the JavaScript part, was the part that scared me. But I realized, and that's when I got started. After 3 years, I kind of took a step back when I got to this purely front-end role and realized that I felt like I could do JavaScript all day long and debug things and implement things. And, given, a given amount of time, I'd be able to come up with a solution. But if you were to hand me, one of these really complex layouts from one of the designers at Warner Brothers, I was terrified because of exactly what you just said. Feeling like I was just blindly throwing darts at a dartboard, not knowing why things were happening. And so I kind of tried to take the same approach I did with JavaScript. And that is, I'm a huge fan of Kyle Simpson, and he kind of always talks about being able to understand things at the next lowest level of abstraction. So if you are in JavaScript land and you are building on top of React, then you should, maybe you don't know line for line how, React itself works, but you should be able to go in there and have enough knowledge of JavaScript, the language, to debug things at the framework level if you hit a bug or you hit a performance problem. Understanding how things are working at a lower level is going to help you create better solutions when you're building on top of it. So all that to say, I didn't want to feel just helpless when I was handed these designs. And so I decided to take a deep dive and understand how the browser was actually rendering things in order to be able to debug things better, and also to help the performance of the pages I was building.
And a lot of times you talk about getting designs from designers and the notion of CSS and having to learn the deep layer just to make designs come to life. Is there still do you still find that disconnect where what people think necessarily is designed for the web matches the expectation within it? Because there is a gap there, isn't there, these days? Still, to some extent.
Yeah, there is definitely a gap there, and it, I think, takes like good communication with the developers and the designers, because there are probably, hopefully this is, I think, what you're maybe saying. If not, please correct me. But a lot of times, you're handed like a mock-up and it's not really fluid, or it hasn't been designed to be fluid. So that's a problem that you still hit a lot.
Yeah, there's always that case of, oh no, it will always look like this on everything. Yeah, because everything is identical. It's like working on the web in the 90s going, you know what, everything is 800 by 600. This is the way it was.
Yep.
I'm old. 800 and 600 was amazing at the time.
Yep.
Heck.
So by figuring out like what the browser was doing, I was just able to fix certain issues that I was having. Most of the time, like a lot of the problems that people were facing were like specificity issues, and then various like performance issues. Understanding the flow that the browser was going through was really helpful. And also a lot of problems that I was having trying to implement these things kind of actually went back to the markup and making sure the markup was correct before I built my styles out. So it's like, as a JavaScript developer, as I got more advanced doing that, I think I paid less and less attention to the CSS and HTML, because it's kind of not cool, because it's not, a programming language, it's just markup language. So, but it actually is really important. Like, that's kind of your backbone, and you need to pay attention to that as well.
So CSS a lot of times actually ends up being a an afterthought and sometimes a punchline. And some people really, really don't like CSS.
I still don't like it that much, but yeah.
But why is it that divisive? Why do so many people like really dislike CSS?
I think for me, it's because I think the way you approach it is very different than you would approach programming. Like when I say programming, I mean like actual, like a programming language like JavaScript or something like that. With CSS, you kind of want to embrace things being global. And with JavaScript, you want things to be pure and isolated usually. So there's that. And then too, it's just, I think there's still that stigma of like CSS not being important because it's just the way things look, and the functionality is what's important. And, given where you work, that might be the case. But when you work for a company like Warner Brothers or Disney or something like that, their brand is everything. So the way it looks is just as important as the functionality.
The way something looks and feels goes a huge part towards the user experience as well, doesn't it? So if something, is doesn't look great or isn't easy to read, isn't easy to interact with, then the whole application can kind of fall to pieces and just feel not right. So it is a very important aspect of web and app development.
Yep, exactly.
I'd really like to kind of jump straight in and talk about, if you could kind of describe how does the browser actually use CSS? So we talked about using CSS to make things look good, but how does it do that, and what's happening when you apply a style sheet, to a HTML document? It'd be really good if you could kind of talk us through that process and just kind of get us started into the CSS in-depth.
Yeah. So the first thing to kind of understand is, and I do a talk on this, and I also have a blog post, but I kind of break it up into 3 parts. So I break it up into the first part, which is the browser has to construct the DOM, and then it also has to construct something called the CSS Object Model, which is very similar to the DOM, and I'll touch on that in a second. I'm kind of doing an overview right now. Once it constructs those 2 things, it has to create a render tree, which is a mashup of the DOM and the CSS Object Model. Once it has a render tree, then it goes through layout, paint, and composite, and we can back up and touch on those individually. But going back to the CSS Object Model, and I don't want to like go too far in depth. Like you can check out my talk and my blog post if you want to go further, so I don't put listeners to sleep as they're listening to this, and we can talk about more fun stuff too because our time is limited. But it's important to note the CSS Object Model and the DOM are not one-to-one. That's why you have the render tree. So the DOM is, like everybody knows what the DOM is, probably who is listening to this. But the CSS Object Model, I'd never heard of it before, but you have to have the CSS Object Model because there's things in the DOM that wouldn't be reflected in the CSS Object Model, like if you have a head element or something like that, or something is display none, then there's no point in having it in the CSS Object Model. But that's kind of what the browser does, is it builds up those 2 things to create this render tree. The other thing that is really important to understand, and you can tweak these with different attributes in your HTML, but by default, CSS is render blocking. So if we're thinking about performance and stuff like that, you have to realize the browser is not going to render your JavaScript until your CSS is completely loaded. So that's another reason why it pays to understand how CSS is working. Once we have the render tree, then you go through layout, paint, and composite, and I want to probably touch on paint and composite when we talk about some bugs and stuff like that, because that's interesting. But layout, paint, and composite super quickly. Layout is just like position and size. Paint is, like the color of things. And then compositing, we probably can talk about when we go a little bit further, but it's an optimization that most browsers have now, and you can kind of think of it as like Photoshop layers.
That's a lot to take in.
I tried to cut it short.
No. I thought that was a very succinct explanation of something that's actually really when you sort of get into sort of the nuts and bolts of how those things connect together to actually give you something that actually renders on the screen, there's been a lot of work over the years within the sort of browser community to sort of try to simplify things that were not necessarily intuitive. The notion of render blocking style sheets, for instance, or inline style sheets that would create render blocks that people weren't even aware of, yet guidance would necessarily go again. Go, no, inline that so you get faster, but at the same time, oh wait, no, that causes a break if you inject here. Even Chrome got a recent feature for that. When you start to break it down, though, and combine these things in to get to that actual render tree, what is the first sort of step from a developer's perspective that you think people sort of misunderstand there? Like in terms of, hey, I've applied the style to this. Like, how does this override, say, my paragraph? Like, obviously, for if you've been around the web for a long time, you know that everything sort of has its own, base set of styles that we override that, gives us that cascade effect. But where's that first pain point? You're like, if you were a developer and you needed to know about this pipeline, this is the first piece that you're like, that's the one. You should know about this.
Yeah. So I think the biggest thing when I've given this talk, and even for me when I was preparing it, I had been a developer for like 3 or 4 years when I wrote this talk, was I still didn't know the rules for calculating specificity. And so if you ever are having to put like an important on something, that is definitely a code smell. And so understanding how specificity actually works and understanding, you want to actually be able to look at a selector and actually calculate the value. And I think, I know based on giving this talk, a lot of developers don't know how to do that. And it's interesting to me because, I'm speaking from somebody who was the very person I wrote this talk for. I would kind of say, well, CSS is stupid and I just want to write JavaScript, when really CSS is just following a spec and it's just following a set of instructions, just like JavaScript. So not even so much talking about the rendering pipeline, but just understanding some of those basic rules, like the specificity calculation.
Do you find that people work around that? Because I see it a lot where you end up with that situation of, I don't know really what the specificity is, and important is sort of the, okay, wait, what are you actually doing? And then from there, it's like, I wrote a whole bunch of JavaScript that does this thing, when that could have been a single line of, CSS. Do you find those more often than not these days?
Oh yeah, definitely. And that's why I say, if you have to add important, there should be in your code a comment as to why you had to do that. Because if you don't understand why you had to add important, then I don't know if you actually fixed it correctly. Or I wouldn't maybe say correctly, but if you hit something that prevented you from adding the appropriate selectors to win the specificity war.
Yeah, you end up with a layered fix, right? That's right.
Yeah.
Is that no good?
Yeah.
No good over time, at least.
Yeah, with anything, I think, because this was the approach I took with JavaScript, I feel like backing this up to when I was learning JavaScript and what I've seen with a lot of programmers getting started. So you are in your boot camp and, you just want to get something to work. So that's what's important. But when you get to your first job, you should understand why things are behaving the way they are and kind of have an opinion about things. And so that goes back to like just throwing the important on there. If you don't know why, then that's a code smell. And, you should understand why that is happening.
I do like the idea of a specificity war.
Specificity war. Yeah.
It sounds like a bad sci-fi novel.
But that really is it. If you understand how many values like a class gets, how many values an ID gets, then you'll be able to systematically understand why, if you are creating the selector, we'll like make a really basic example. Even if you have something like down at the bottom of your style sheet, so it should win based on the cascade, because specificity takes into account this selector calculation plus where it appears in, in the process of rendering it, if it's at the top of the page or the bottom of the page. But if you're adding something at the bottom of the page and you have to put a bang important on it, I would almost say when you add that comment as to why, like, you should actually put what the selector value is, so that, you've just kind of like proven to the person that you understand this is not working the way it is because the value is this. And there's this other place in our styles where the value is this and this value is less than that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
That's really good advice.
Yeah.
It's hard though when it's a Friday and you just want to whack a button on it and go for a drink.
I mean, of course, there's always trade-offs. Like, if it's taking you forever and you're in a startup and you just got to get out the door, then sure, But if we're talking about writing good code, then you should know why.
Which we always should be, of course.
Yeah, definitely. I can, once we maybe talk about like bugs and stuff like that, I'll get into more of the common issues that I feel like trip people up, and how the underlying browser, is how understanding how the browser is actually working help you understand why that is.
Yeah, maybe we can segue into that slightly now. So, like how you go about debugging some of these complicated issues, given the knowledge that you've gained from understanding CSS more in depth. Like, I don't know whether it would make more sense to talk about some of the common problems, and then maybe you could go through the process of how you would go about fixing those, knowing what you know now. Is that sound like a good idea? Cool.
Totally. So the next thing I'll talk about then, I guess, is when we were talking about layout, paint, and composite. So understanding which properties are causing which part of that rendering pipeline to fire is really important. And this is where, so when I was writing this talk, I always heard people talking about certain CSS properties being hardware accelerated, but I really had no idea what that actually meant. And going back to me, I don't like just using words or writing code when I don't understand what it's actually doing or what it actually means. So I wanted to understand what hardware acceleration actually meant. And in the process of doing that, I discovered that there are certain properties that are more performant than others, because when we talk about hardware acceleration, what that means is it's talking about the compositing part of the pipeline. So if you think about it, if you trigger a layout, which is the very first part of the pipeline, you're always going to have to trigger a paint and then a composite. And of those three, paint is usually the most expensive. So you would want to, at all costs, avoid a relayout. And then if you go down the next level to paint, a paint will trigger a composite usually. So you would want to avoid a paint. And then you go down to the next level, and if possible, you would always want to reach for properties that only trigger a composite. And that's what we mean by some of these CSS properties being hardware accelerated. And then that even brings you back to, a lot of times you have a choice if you want to use JavaScript or if you want to use CSS, when you have two ways to go about, or more than two ways. There's tons of ways to go about solving one problem. And I know for me, I would always reach for JavaScript because that's what I felt comfortable with. But some of the designers that are working with, like, super talented, they could write CSS pretty well. And it was amazing to me to have them in, one line of CSS, be able to solve something that it took me, 5 lines of JavaScript to do. And if you, are doing JavaScript, then you're gonna have to test it, hopefully. So understanding when to use JavaScript, when to use CSS, all that to say, you always want to reach for these properties that are hardware accelerated. So that would be things like opacity or transforms. So, there's multiple ways to go about, like, changing or maybe hiding something on the page. You'd always want to use opacity because that's going to be the most performant.
There's a really good website that I tend to use quite a lot called CSSTriggers.com. And this basically outlines all of the different properties and what browser processes they cause in all the different browsers. So as you said, if you look at that, we'll make sure the link goes in the show notes. If you look there, if you look at opacity, you can see that it's forces the compositing process instead of layout and everything else. So you can easily see what the effect of changing different properties on your elements will have. And as you said, you want to be going for the really cheap ones.
Yeah, totally. That's an awesome website. I would highly recommend people looking at that. And so that's where understanding, what the browser's doing is actually just going to make you a better CSS developer because, or just a better front-end developer in general, because you're knowing, what the most performant thing is going to be and reaching for that. And you have a reason for, why you chose to do it one way versus another way.
So very briefly speaking about performance in general, so a resource like Leon just brought up is really, really helpful. But how do you, other than just seeing, oh, my application is choppy or just things don't seem to be running as smoothly as I would like, what tools are there out there to help you identify performance problems with your CSS?
Yeah, so you can profile things just like you would your JavaScript and see it's always changing in Chrome where it actually is, but you can actually open up the Chrome developer tools and you can inspect how long layout is taking, how long paint is taking, and how long composite is taking.
That's awesome.
It's pretty helpful. But I will also give the caveat, for most sites, JavaScript is always going to be the most expensive. So although we're talking about how important it is to pay attention to CSS, JavaScript is usually going to be the most expensive one there. I will say this too, in the process of kind of reading a bunch of information on all of this, another reason why I think it's important to understand CSS and especially kind of keep up to date on it, because again, going back to what I was doing, I was constantly flooding myself with information on, the latest and greatest of what's happening in the JavaScript ecosystem, but I wasn't doing it for CSS. And I read a post someone put where they converted a Flexbox layout, or I'm sorry, they converted a floated layout to a Flexbox layout, and it rendered, I forget what the actual numbers were, but it was significantly faster. So I think browsers are paying more and more attention to this, especially Chrome, with Houdini, which I know you guys have talked about in the past, and we kind of talked about even at the beginning of this podcast. But so that's why it's really important to keep up to date on that kind of stuff too.
Yeah, optimizing the critical rendering path, which sort of combines all those very things between your JavaScripts and your style sheets and everything else, is its own sort of ongoing topic of things, to be certain. The depth there, which I don't know that, I hope more developers start to understand, because it really does sort of show you the intersections of how things interact and the reason why your progressive rendering of of elements on a screen is important, and how you get those things faster, and why style sheet performance is important, to your point about depth and and the way that things do composite. I think that's still a skill that most folks do not acquire until after they've run into the, oh my gosh, why doesn't this paint for 15 seconds sort of scenario, which at that point is usually the worst time, I guess. But there's no better, there's no time better than the present to take a look at it.
Yeah. I mean, and this is too why I'm really excited about a lot of the stuff that Chrome is doing. They're really, really, really doing good at implementing stuff for Houdini. So I think it's kind of making CSS cool again. Or making it cool for the first time, maybe? I don't know.
I don't know. I always thought CSS was cool. I like CSS.
I never used to until I went through a similar process to Aimee, which is really trying to understand kind of how a lot of it works. Like a year ago, I did a Pluralsight course on the Web Animations API. I really like the idea of creating really performant, really cool animations with JavaScript, but I kind of realized, well, I really need to understand how this actually affects things and how it actually works. I went through a similar process, but as soon as I kind of started to understand how this stuff fits together, that's kind of really got me excited and interested in CSS again, because it was just fascinating and really interesting. So it kind of starting to learn about this stuff kind of convinced me that CSS definitely was cool.
I just love deep diving on this stuff. So I was, like, yes, I was not super excited about doing all this stuff in CSS, and I was like, I got to figure out a way to make this exciting for myself. This is how I'm going to do it. I guess if we want, I can get into like another thing that I learned in the process of doing this that I think trips people up a ton. And this is probably a pretty bad bug that I feel like still a lot of people aren't aware of.
Cool. Please go ahead.
Okay. So this is like, when I gave this talk, I have like 3 practical things, which is like specificity, and then the whole rendering pipeline of all this. And then I also talk a lot about Z-index, and that is a problem. I think, I don't know, I'm curious what you guys think, but as for me, that's probably one of the biggest problems I have faced when I'm trying to debug my CSS. What do you guys think?
Just set it to 1001. Be done with it.
Yep. So Z-index, the trick to understanding your problems with Z-index is understanding what a stacking context is. I had no idea what this was before. Sorry, Siri's talking to me. I'll tell her to not right now. Anyways, so Z-index, it's all about understanding the stacking context. And the big thing here, the big gotcha, is that so when you apply a Z-index, it creates a new stacking context. And the trick to being able to debug, if you're applying a Z-index and you're applying a value there and it's not moving where you think it's going to move, you need to understand where the parent is inside of your HTML. And by the parent, I mean that's the element that's triggering the new stacking context, because it's going to confine all of the children elements on that parent to the specific stacking context. But the big gotcha that I've seen trip a lot of people up is that there are other properties that besides the index that are going to trigger a new stacking context. So they had me go over to a company here in Nashville that has a really large engineering team, because they had like 3 senior developers, I think, on this really bad Z-index issue. For a couple of days, they couldn't figure out why. It was because opacity was creating a new stacking context. And so if you think about it, like, you could even have potentially like a really major issue with CSS where, you're not understanding how your stacking contexts are working and hiding something on the page that shouldn't be hidden or something like that. So it's all about understanding the stacking context.
I actually did not know that. That's very cool.
I always like the visualization in DevTools in terms of stacking things, which I want to say Firefox had it first in terms of Z-index layers and the way things composite on top. I always thought that was an interesting way to approach it, because it is difficult to sort of grasp if you've never worked with anything that requires that sort of context.
Yeah. So going into the DevTools and figuring out, you could, hover over that element and see what it is, but trying to figure out what the parent element is and what your stacking context is going to be immensely beneficial. The other trick is that the browser, because it's actually limited on the programming language, is that you can't set a Z-index past a specific value. And I think that's like you couldn't give it a value of 3 billion because the programming language literally won't let you set a number that high.
Always limiting my ability to stack things.
Maybe that's why your page is taking 15 seconds to paint, Justin. if there's 15 billion layers.
So even CSS goes back to programming.
Justin likes to put everything up as high as he possibly can.
Yeah, it's like I'm climbing Everest. Like, I want those elements all the way there at the top. I'm sorry. I feel like I've taken the Z-index thing too far, which is funny in and of itself. No, I'm sorry. That was not meant to be a pun. You can't take the Z-index thing too far. So, what other types of bugs do you see in that regard? Like, the Z-index one, I agree. I feel like I feel like Z-index is massively misunderstood, and the things that people do to Z-index is generally unperformant. Do you find other bugs, be it browser or just developer understanding, where people do something because they're trying to get it done, but in reality, what they're really doing is shooting themselves in the foot?
Yeah, I think it's really those two. I did like a Twitter poll before I did the talk to try to get an idea for kind of what problems the community face the most, and it was usually positioning, Z-index, and specificity. And I think with Flexbox now, it's made positioning not as much of a pain point, so I don't really touch on that one so much anymore, other than, you know, how Flexbox is more performant. But specificity was by far the one that was tripping people up the most. And honestly, it's kind of, I think if you understand the rules, usually the easiest one to debug, because it's very systematic. You just have to do the calculations. Other than those three, I haven't heard of like, and there's, you know, everybody talks about like centering something on the page, but again, that's a positioning thing. And I think Flexbox does a really good job at that.
Yeah, the Flexbox with and now Grid, like between those two things, like, man, I feel like just you know, it's an embarrassment of riches. Just
a whole new world.
It is, isn't it though?
It
and
is.
it's such a lovely world now, where like, oh wow, I can position things and like, you know, I don't have to do weird control break hacks to make this float work.
Easily vertical aligning things. Oh wow.
Like if you understand too, I guess I could talk about that for a second, how a float works behind the scenes. So when the browser is going through the first part, the layout part, when it sees a float, it's going to position it as far right or as far left as possible. And so you don't, like, you're having to move things with margin and padding, whereas with Flexbox, we have the ability to kind of center things better. And so, like, again, going back and understanding at a lower level what the browser is doing, makes you realize how much float stinks.
Yeah, digging in really, you know, it's been a theme throughout the whole episode. You know, getting that understanding of the lower level, just one before where you're working, can really help solve so many different problems. Do you know, is there any tooling available today that you know of that can kind of help with understanding these different concepts? I'm not sure I know of any that do, but you know, when we talk about JavaScript frameworks and those kind of things, there's lots of libraries and frameworks and tools that can help you kind of work around some of the difficult problems or difficult things to overcome with the JavaScript language. Is there anything similar for CSS that you know of?
I've actually found that just the Chrome developer tools have been enough. Just understanding how to use those tools is the biggest thing. When I'm debugging my CSS, I just use, you know, the knowledge that I've gained from understanding this stuff and the developer tools, and that's usually enough for me to figure out what the problem is.
Yeah, definitely.
DevTools. Yeah, you can't go wrong with DevTools. Like, hey, Justin, or wonderful podcast people, what should we learn? DevTools.
Yeah.
Chrome, Firefox, don't care. Just learn them because they will make your life infinitely more easy.
Totally. Like, I feel like a lot of, I'm sure more advanced developers too, but like a lot of newer developers are like, they have a hard time deciding, you know, do I learn Vue? Do I learn React? Do I focus on Angular? And there are things that you can focus on that are going to be universal. So DevTools being one of them.
I feel like I find a new button every day. Every day new in there.
Yeah, there's always something new too. Totally.
So I see in the list of questions down there at the bottom a Shadow DOM / CSS question. Danny, did you put that question in there?
Maybe I put that question there.
I'm curious now. I want to know. I want you to educate me because I don't know.
Well, yeah, go ahead, Danny.
Okay.
I want to see where this goes.
No. Okay. So I am just curious how Aimee, you specifically, but everybody here, what we think about shadow DOM interactions with CSS, because we just talked a lot before about learning how the cascade works and making sure that selectors are specific. And then you're like, all this cool shadow DOM stuff. And then all of that goes out the window. And so I'm just curious how different. And so for those that may not be aware, when you create a shadow root on an element, usually on a custom element, when you create that shadow root, CSS doesn't tap into it at all. So it's isolated and contained. It's almost like it's a different document. And so I'm just curious what folks think about that in a CSS world. Justin.
Well, Danny. I think in a CSS world, we do have some gaps, but realistically, from a spec standpoint, we have part and theme coming, which I think make life easier to create the encapsulation we want in terms of the style sheets that we have, right? So we want sort of CSS encapsulation within sort of that component world, or within that shadow root. And part and theme will help sort of us style those things in a way that is similar to the pseudo selector style we use now for things. This is not perfect by any means. I know this came up on Twitter the other day, but piercing shadow roots was expensive initially with things like deep, where you could transverse into a root and do styly sort of things, but that was really very not performing, which is why we don't have it anymore. So I think from a cascading standpoint, I think the CSS will continue to work within the shadow root context as you're writing stuff, and there is a polyfill now, or a shim, for part and theme, which I know the Vaadin folks use. So you can use that now too, to sort of deal with the problem of, hey, how am I going to get my styles into, theming elements and things of that nature. And then the rules are still going to roughly be the same. Like, there's nothing inherently different in terms of the way things layout, render, and composite, and paint within that scope of things. So you're not going to have to relearn, everything that is CSS to make sure that, you're just going to tack on a little additional knowledge to make sure that you can theme and style things down the chain. And again, you can be specific within that as either the author of that component or that shadow root, as well as the person on the upside, the developer who's consuming. So I can specify against those parts or themes and then magically make it all work. So I think the story is getting better there. We're just not all the way there yet.
Yeah, it's still pretty early days. I think the main thing is just understanding the difference and kind of how Shadow DOM affects things in terms of CSS. And that's one of its great features, is the fact that it doesn't get styles from the outer document. I mean, want the encapsulation. That's kind of the whole point of it. And we're still in the early days of figuring out, solutions for theming and stuff. And as you said, the part and the theme thing was looking really promising. So, time will tell, I think, see how we solve all of those problems. But I think overall, it's looking pretty good.
Sounds like some of the good parts from JavaScript. I like it. I like encapsulation.
Yeah, encapsulation, I think, and actually we're getting that now in CSS as well, right? That's another thing in the pipe in terms of sort of encapsulated CSS, which will be great. And again, like, to your point, like, there's a lot of things in the pipe for CSS that makes CSS very sort of malleable, from Houdini and encapsulation to, a lot of the new stuff that Tab's sort of been pushing down the line in terms of, next phase features of things, which is great because you should know the CSS, I think, is the general takeaway if you're listening today.
Yep. It's not so bad if you understand what it's doing.
So, Aimee, we're just about running up against time. Is there anything we have not specifically touched on that we probably should have asked, but, well, I can only speak for myself, that I'm just too daft to ask or forgot to ask?
No, I think we're good. If people ever have more questions, I can put links to the talk I gave and the blog post I have. And then also, if people ever want to hit me up on Twitter. My DMs are open and I can try to answer questions there. Might take me a while to get back to you sometimes, but I'll try.
I've got loads of links and resources that kind of describe how the layout and paint and composite processes work in the browser in terms of some of the performance stuff we've talked about. So I'll make sure I get those in the show notes as well, alongside Aimee's talk, etc. So that'll be good.
Fantastic. Well, Aimee, thank you so much for coming on the show today. We appreciate it. Thank you for coming back. It's been too long. Come back sooner next time.
Thank you, guys.
Talk about stuff.
Thanks so much for having me.
Danny, Leon, closing thoughts?
I still have problems with Shadow DOM.
I have problems with Danny.
The debate of Shadow DOM will continue forever. I love it so much. All right. Well, if that's the closing thoughts, then we're going to wrap up episode number 171 of the Web Platform Podcast. Today, we've talked to Aimee Knight about CSS and all the wonderful things you can do with it, and the things maybe you don't know about render trees and pipelines and whatnot. We'll get all those show links into the notes so that you can visit and read and learn some more. So join us next week when we talk more things web, more things platform. Have a great rest of your week.
Bye, everybody.